Sorry, Laurie. Today, we wanted to talk about the European strategy to achieve a net zero emission industry. But more precisely, we want to look at how we can solve the very difficult trade-off between making the transition, inducing more industry and renewing industry in Europe, solving our competitiveness issues there, or addressing any competitiveness issues that may arise in the process, but also probably keep in mind our principle in terms of multilateralism and the way we see trade globally. The world has changed. The world is going to change. And if we stay exactly the same, it's not going to make it. So necessarily we need to change. So we are going to organize this debate on that. We are going first to have intervention from our experts. It's going to be a 10-minute intervention. And then we will have a debate with everyone. So respect the rules in terms of time initially. And then we can have a very lively debate. I'm sure that plenty of persons have many things to say and to confront. The point is to look at the global situation, the country situation, and to inform everyone of what are the global challenges and what are the national constraints in those global challenges. We are all European, and we all want Europe to succeed, but we also know that every country may have its own logic and own targets, own difficulties. So that's going to also to be something very interesting to point. Before we start, Thomas, you want to add a word?
Yes, thank you very much, Javier. I have not so much to add to what you said to explain the reasons and the context of this debate, but I'm very pleased that we achieved again to bring together a very European panel and so continue our well-established cooperation with OFCE. Thank you very much for the hospitality and for this cooperation, Javier. I think it's very important that we can have this kind of discussion. Of course, since the pandemic, we are used to have online discussions, but we decided to bring together here the panelists. We think that it's better to have this kind of discussion, and that is also helping to networking, and that's also one of the objectives we perceive with this event. I think it is very important to discuss this question. Javier also mentioned that, of course, we are living in difficult times and there are a lot of challenges. Jean Pisani-Ferry has recently spoken of a decade of all difficulties. That means that we have not only to face the challenge of ecological transition, but also the consequences of the pandemic and also the present war in Ukraine. So there are a lot of difficulties to manage, and it is important how we can achieve to manage this. That's a discussion we want to have together with you. And again, thank you very much for coming to Paris, for being here to join us here in this debate. And I hope we will have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much. And I hand over again to Javier, who will be the chair of this panel. Thank you.
I'm going simply to moderate the panel. And my chairing is going to be a very light one. So I propose that we start directly by the debate and the experts. So Elvire Fabry from the Jacques Delors Institute here in Paris is going to start. we like you to set up the global perspective there and to give us the your analysis of the political, economical situation around trade and in the context of the transition, what it may mean. So I guess you're going to speak about the US and China and not only on Europe. If you want to say a word on France in that context, you're welcome, even if it is not your specialty, because your specialty is geopolitics of trade. And so for 10 minutes, Elvire, no more than 10 minutes, to be more accurate. I leave you the floor. I'll make you some signs if you go over the time. Thank you, Elvire.
Thank you, Xavier and Thomas for the invitation, and hello to everybody. Very pleased to be with you today. Well, yes, as I'm the first one to launch a little the discussion, I will take the broad scope for this discussion and go back on the major shift that this issue that we're addressing today has witnessed since the EU has committed to its carbon neutrality for 2050. Initially, the EU was a sort of appeared like the leader, and since 2019, now it has been followed broadly in the world, even by China, even if it's for 2060. But since then, the EU has developed its regulatory setup, and while we have faced major events which are really impacting very deeply these debates and this strategic thinking. First of all, of course, with the COVID. The COVID has shed up light on the vulnerabilities of supply chains. That was the first issue, but which has impacted much more strategic thinking broader than the green transition. Then we have the war in Ukraine, really urgency to get out of from fossil fuels. And all the different objectives set by the debate around Repower EU, with the priority given to the development of renewable energies with the objective to increase the solar plants by 3 for 2030, wind turbines by 2 for 2030, the development of IVs in the automobile sector, all the different targets that we know very well. Then came the IRA. And IRA has been a new major shock because it has pushed us from the sole objective of green transition to a more competitive ground. And we remember all the debates that have been that had sparked during the fall in the EU after 2 months of discrete negotiation between the European Commission and Washington. The debate, which started in November in the EU, was very defensive. And I think that by now, when we look back at what was the impact of the IRA on the European debate, I think we can consider that it has been quite an interesting wake-up call for the Europeans. Because while the US were engaging into mass production of green technologies and development of renewable energy, it had attracted more attention on the European side on our dependencies on the Chinese markets, and that we would face a scenario where we would we could take the risk to either depend more on imports of Chinese green technologies or American green technologies if we didn't boost our own capacity of production of those technologies. And we first had already in 2021 major concerns with the rise of prices when prices of some components were really quickly increased, like for lithium, for cobalt, the prices had already multiplied by 2. Copper, aluminium, they have increased between 25 and 40% in 2021. For batteries, the prices have increased by 10% in 22 compared to 21, 20% for the wind sector, solar, 25%. So a risk of inflation, which was already there. and some more concern with the concentration of production of those components or technologies, notably in China, with 3/4 of the global batteries produced in China, 70% of the cathodes, 85% of the anodes, more than 50% of the refining of lithium, cobalt, graphite, 90% of the wafers, all the different, all those numbers that now we have very, very high in mind, and major investments continuing in China to increase the capacity of production of batteries, with an increase of production which could be multiplied by 6 by 2030. This means that I mean, the wake-up call for the Europeans happened just at a moment when we had the increased concern as well with the geopolitical rivalry between the China and US, which is as well impacting very much the capacity of green transition of the Europeans. We were surprised to see that China didn't reply immediately to the ban on semiconductors in October, but now we see how China is preparing its institutional setup with in January the announcement of export control license on wafers for solar panels, and now the decision also to have at least the instruments in place for controls on components of green technologies, and notably for the refining sector, which means that China is not intends to keep its not only to keep its competitive advantage in those sectors, but maybe ready to use those export control as economic coercion leverage, and with the risk that we wouldn't have access to those components, most needed components, to speed up the development of those manufacturing capacities in the EU. And I think that this is something that we have more clearly in mind addressing China, and that even has weighted in the position of the French President Emmanuel Macron when he went in Peking recently, and while he was calling to maintain some constructive dialogue with China, with the risk that we could be that Europeans could be targeted as much as the Americans by some economic coercion measures, which could be targeting as much member states as companies, specific companies. And I mean, it's something that we have to keep in mind for the forthcoming years. A quick word on the impact of IRA. The concern is not so much at the moment on the broad envelope of public aid, the state aid that is provided to the industry. The current, I mean, the envelope is huge, but the Europeans have already put on the table comparable, let's say, subsidies for manufacturing and even for the production of renewable energies. The worry is more focused on the fact that large part of those state aids have no ceilings, and that beyond the deadline of 2030, there could be this is providing to the industry much more longer deadlines for investment, and even for investment that would be decided by 2030. they would apply for a decade, so it would mean for 2040. So it's much more longer view for the investment than the temporary flexibilization of aid that we have on the European side, which is temporary until 2026, and which would still be submitted to additional negotiation between the Europeans. But they're engaging into massive production of green technologies, and overall, the first assessment that I made on the impact of IRA, that the US could be multiplying by 2 the capacity of production of renewable energy, which would mean that it will almost no, sorry, not multiplying by 2, but that the capacity of production of renewable energy would be twice the one that they have gained with shale gas production a decade ago, which means that it would be a major shift in energy transition, and that they could succeed to produce some green technologies that would be very competitive in terms of prices. It would cut the price of solar panels by between 20 and 40%, for wind turbines by 50%, which would mean not only a major leverage to attract some companies to settle in the US, which is the first concern, but also that it would be very competitive in a growing global market in the coming decades. And when we look back at the drafting of the Green Industrial Plan, the European plan, it was interesting to see that it was not drafted as a negative defensive strategy towards addressing IRA concern, but more as a positive strategy, considering that we will have to grasp the benefit of a growing market, and that to remain competitive with this condition would be much more harder. Not to be too long, because the idea was just to present the broad scope of this discussion. The concern for the European response are that in the Net Zero Industrial Plan and with the Critical Material Act, we have broad targets for 2030, but there's no more details sector by sector on how to achieve those main goals. We have a very fragmented aid proposal with the more complex setup for the industries, depending if they are at what level of the supply chain they are positioned. If it's at the very initial step of innovation, and they can address the innovation fund, but if they are more mature companies, they can get loans from the European Investment Bank. It's rather a complex landscape that they are navigating in. While on the US side, the access to state subsidies, it's much more quicker, simpler, and once again is providing that long-term visibility for companies. The reaction of the industry on the European side hasn't been so positive. They have welcomed all those targets, and the fact that on the European side, in the end, the initiatives that came from the European Commission came quite quickly, but they continue to request more details on how to coordinate between public actors and the companies at the national level. Despite the shock of simplification that was intended by the European Commission in its proposal, they continue to request more more simplification and a quicker access to those state aids. We have a problem with social acceptability for all what concerns extraction and the refining objectives that have been set up, and that would need to be addressed much more intensively by the at the political level by the member states. And we have growing concern with the global south in the way the Europeans are engaging with a much more, let's say, a regulatory pillar in the European strategy, which is an issue that has to be that requires much more engagement at the level of the member states and of the EU at a moment when we need to be in a capacity to ratify more trade agreements to secure access to raw material much needed for the green transition. Just to conclude, just to add a word on the French view. Obviously, the speed, the new speed that this green transition strategy is undergoing since last year is very much aligned with the French approach of open strategic autonomy, and it has been very welcome viewed from Paris, but we perceive at the moment also the strong expectation from other member states on how the French government is supporting the need for an open green transition, meaning that all what has to deal with the keeping markets open and bringing the conditions for diversification and to secure access to those raw materials, which need maybe a stronger stance from the French government. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Elvire. Just a very quick question. For many decades, oil prices have been a strong element of global geopolitics. Are we entering into an era where the price of energy for the industry locally is going to be a geopolitical object, or is it? It doesn't seem to be really in the concern explicitly today, but maybe this is a very important issue for every blocks there.
But I think that before IRA came on the table, we already heard the concern of many companies who were opting for more increased investment or in China or in the US, independently from the green transition and all this this specific sector. And when we have in mind, we have in mind that the BASF announced that it was stopping its investments in the EU precisely at the moment when it was investing hugely in China. So yes, it will be a major issue, and once again, it's something that China could use also with the more cohesive intentions, also to increase prices, the cost of the the cost of the green transition at a moment when its own economy is facing some difficulties for the rebound that we expected after the end of the zero COVID policy. So it could be a way to compensate also by rising those prices for its exports.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Janek Stoitz, sorry for the pronunciation. That's good?
That's good.
No, that's not good.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Okay. You're working at the Institute for Microfinance, and you are director of the Department of the Future. So that's what Desenat Zukunft means,
Exactly.
which is a nice name.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
And you're coming from Germany.
I'm coming from Germany. I'm coming from Berlin. Thank you very much for the invitation. Also to you, Thomas. And thank you, Elvira, for setting the stage and also bringing this global perspective. I'm going to speak a little bit about, and that very much links to your last question, sort of the frictions between national industrial policy, in particular with the German perspective, and European industrial policy. And as you will see, I will argue that national energy costs, in particular, also across the European Union, is one of the factors that may drive industrial restructuring, and that could be one of the sort of hindering blocks for more European industrial policy. But let me start with a German perspective. You probably all remember that Bruno Le Maire and Robert Habeck, the Minister of the Economy in Germany, joined forces and called for a European industrial policy beginning of the year, and Robert Habeck in another occasion with German industry also called 2023 as the year of industrial policy. And when you closely look at what happened since then in Germany, you can really see that the government is pushing for a very national version, for a very German version of industrial policy. Germany welcomed the state aid reform in favor of the temporary crisis and transition framework. And in fact, it is arguing for further relaxing state aid guidelines. There was a public talk with Minister Habeck and EU Commissioner Vestager 2 weeks ago in Berlin, where Habeck quite bluntly stated that, well, the European Union should be happy that a country like Germany, with the financial means to do it, drives or pushes industrial policy. And he made the case for further relaxing the state aid guidelines. And when you look at the main policy initiatives the Ministry of the Economy in Germany is pushing forward, then one big issue is the industry electricity tariff, a new industry electricity tariff to subsidize energy consumption of big industrial players in Germany on a level of 6 cents, sort of a bridge solution until 2030. And then this bridge solution, which is more like a direct payment, would be sort of changed to a long-term scheme and a mixture of PPAs and a contracts for difference. That's something we don't have yet in Germany. Then the second part is a carbon contracts for difference for heavy industry. So really a new scheme to fund the difference in the costs of the net zero technology and the fossil technology. It's a huge program. They have earmarked 20 billion for it. For the electricity tariff, by the way, it's also between 20 and 30 billion. So we're speaking 50 billion already for German industry. And then the third pillar is sort of a case-by-case bespoke support for large projects, for new battery fabrics, for EVs. I mean, Tesla, who now started a plant in the north of Germany, and Intel is opening a chips plant in the south. And really in these sort of programs, there's little can be seen of a European approach to industrial policy. And you may wonder why is that? What is the reason for that? And German industry is struggling. I think it's fair to say that output of German industry has been declining since 2018, and since the energy crisis and the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, in particular, energy-intensive industries in Germany took quite a hit. And unlike in most other countries, in the European Union, with sort of the exception of Belgium and the Netherlands, energy-intensive industries are really big still in Germany. And at Dezerner Zukunft, we sort of in the middle of a project where we look at the long-term competitiveness outlook of German industry compared to industry in other countries in Europe, but also other places in the world with cheap renewable potential. Because, I mean, obviously, industry has to transition to renewable energies. Right now, German, just as French and Spanish industry, is at a disadvantage in terms of gas and electricity prices because of the war. But in the next 20 years, here in Europe and elsewhere, we need to change to renewable energies. And now from a German perspective, what is interesting is Germany doesn't have cheap potential for renewable energies. And so one of the big anxieties in Germany is that actually the industrial base and the energy intensive industrial base in Germany may step by step, as we transition, vanish and relocate to other places in Europe and to other places beyond Europe. And our analysis actually confirms that. So we look at green electricity costs, green hydrogen costs, and how they feed through industrial value chains. And what we find is that for key energy intensive basic material products, German production will be at a cost premium of 20 to 80% compared to cheap renewable locations in and outside of Europe. And that, of course, is quite a challenge and quite a threat, and may explain why the current strategy of the German government is really to push for a national subsidy and industrial policy program, as opposed to a more European one that may incentivize relocations within the European Union. Now, in terms of financing, the German government is quite divided. We have, it's divided on many things, which you're probably aware of these days. We have the Ministry of the Economy, which is really pushing for these nationally focused subsidies for industry, and we have a finance ministry which is run by the Liberals in Germany, which is heavily opposed to it. So as of now, we actually don't know if these programs that I just mentioned will become reality. And yeah, let me conclude, or sort of jump to the European level and then conclude. I think for the European Union, one of the biggest challenges right now is to really convince member states, including Germany, that it's a benefit to move from a national targeted approach to really a European approach that maximizes the potential of the continent. And in terms of industry, I think one needs to realize that this European approach necessarily entails a sort of European-wide restructuring, and that may include that, for example, steel is no longer produced at the current capacity in Germany, but for example, in Sweden, where we have really cheap hydropower, or for example, in the south of Spain, or we even import it from the US, from Australia, or from the Middle East. And I think there is quite a chance though, because if Europe wants to compete globally against places like the US that are now supported by the IRA, but which also have the benefit that after 2030, when the subsidies of the IRA fade, they still have super cheap renewable potential. So these industries that relocate now to the US because of the IRA, they actually have the perspective of producing there with really cheap renewables, really cheap hydrogen. So it's not sort of a temporary funding and then you go to a higher sort of normal again. No, in US, just like in Australia, these cheap prices can actually structurally be maintained. And it's not true for some places in the EU. But if sort of we want to maintain European strength or even increase it, and I think we need to take a European approach, And yeah, convincing national policymakers of this, I think, is the challenge. But if we take this European perspective, then I think it's clear that we need a bigger European envelope for European industrial policy. I think it's very much important that we create a European-wide level playing field for energy subsidies, which we don't have as of now. European market, electricity market design reform is important. PPAs and contracts for difference really across countries. I mean, we need to ramp up renewables everywhere and not just in some countries which can afford it. And then linking to the Net Zero Industry Act, I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical with the production targets of the European Union because, and we alluded to it, I think across these industries, Europe has a different chance of actually being competitive globally. And just to take one example, I think PV solar industry will not be an industry where Europe really will have structurally lasting competitive advantages. It's a commodified product that can and will be produced cheaper elsewhere. But if you really look into sort of the industrial structures, then I think there are opportunities to really go into batteries, go into EVs, go into hydrogen-based sectors, maybe not so much in Germany, but elsewhere. And so I guess a more focused, less national, more European approach would be the way forward. And now I guess the challenge is really to get member states on board.
Thank you very much, Yannick. Is it the current position of the German government to have such a global European industrial policy, or is it what you call for?
That's what I would go for. It's
okay.
Not that's not the position of the German government. Not yet.
Okay. David Panzeri,
yes,
coming from Milano. In
correct.
Italy.
Yes,
Yes, you're working at ECHO, and so you're going to give us the
Italian perspective.
perfect. Perfecto.
Perfecto. And thank you, Xavier, and thank you, Thomas, for inviting me. It's great to be here and great to be able to listen to my colleagues' presentations also. I will start with the description of the Italian situation by saying that Italy does take industrial policy and the European Green Deal industrial plan seriously, which is not something that Italy does for every single European policy. And there is a debate on this. Basically, first of all, this debate is within the context of Italy's ambition, stated ambition of reindustrializing itself by 2024, when it will hold the G7 presidency. Italy is and remains the second manufacturing country within Europe after Germany. But it has a very specific peculiarity, which is a really high penetration of small and medium enterprises. In 2022, there were around 370,000, which account for 41% of GDP and 48% of exports. So we're talking about really small, an atomized production system, which obviously means that it's a slightly different industrial environment as many other European countries. So very recently, the Italian minister, Urso, announced a plan within the European plan of the Green Deal Industrial Plan, an ambition to foster and sustain the production supply chains, which is a key element. 48% of small medium enterprises, 48% of export from small and medium enterprises means that these are part of integrated supply chain within Europe, with Germany, but also with other countries. So the fact of putting so much emphasis on the supply chains is, I think, a key element. This means producing the key elements that are crucial to the transition and which can be used potentially for various industries. One of the implications of this strategy is obviously having access to the raw materials. And again, Italy here is aligned with the Commission. So with the Raw Material Act, which has attracted attention. Italy's ideas are aligned with the Commission. So there is the extraction, there is the recycling, there is the refining. Refining, crucial, because obviously now it's an industry that's dominated by China, and there is an Italian as well as European ambition to bring the refining in Italy and in Europe. Recycling is already an excellence in Italy, and from all the various material from the circular economy, and it wants to bring the expertise also to the critical materials in particular. And we're talking about supply chains, and we're talking about recycling for all the materials that are crucial to what are the Italian industries, because obviously there is the other side of that 41% of GDP from small and medium enterprises, which is big companies which produce in areas which are directly affected by trade transition, such as cement production, steel making, and the automotive. The automotive alone last year accounted for around 5% of Italian GDP. So there is a focus on supply chains insofar as they are integrated with Europe, but also in particularly they are crucial to Italian industries. Within this, there is lots of stated cooperation with the European Union. The minister announced that it spoke to the Commission to ensure and to coordinate that what gets built in Italy is not replicated or not replicating elsewhere in Italy. So a coordinated approach, again, which is not always the case with Italy. If we focus a little bit more on the automotive industry, so one of the key industries in Italy, what the Italian position is that there is a need to invest more into battery making, so gigafactories, and some of which are projects that are already being started in Italy, although our analysis show that there is a risk of some of these being delocalized to the US or other countries as a follow-up from the IRA. So maybe there is more to be done in the policies here. But also there is an excellence already of automaking and automotive production in Italy, which, according to the minister, is already doing its own part in transitioning to the electric car and to the European objective in this sense. It is partially true, but we believe that more should be done in the sense of supporting this transition, partly because some of this, it is true that there is an increased production in electric vehicles in Italy, but given the market, which is relatively stagnant in Italy of electric vehicles, most of these vehicles probably end up being exported. So there isn't yet a sufficient market in Italy. So one of the key elements we think which is lacking in this Italian strategy and is probably lacking in the European strategy compared to the IRA is a support to consumption. So the need to creating self-sustaining markets for these green goods, which is a crucial way of ensuring that there are the economies of scale to make sure that it's viable to have these industries in Italy or in Europe. And this is an element of the IRA, and it's, I think, missing from the European strategy. The other element, which is an area where Italy is keen, is the funding. Italy is, when there was the question on the opening of the Green Deal Industrial Plan, effectively made it clear that to Italy it was a trade-off of allowing the opening of the state aid regime and the relaxation of state regime in exchange for the sovereignty fund. And this is one key area of interest for Italy. So to have this fund in order to be able to finance some of this transition. And I think this is a key element, not just in terms of the actual financing, whichever way this fund ends up to be funded, whether it's through central fiscal capacity or, as the current proposal seems to be, through own resources / review of the multi-annual financial framework. But it's also, and Elvira was alluding to this earlier on, it's also about giving industry certainty of the fact that this is going to be sustained and the money is going to be coming. Because one of the key elements of the IRA is that it's for 10 years. In fact, $369 billion is spread over 10 years. If you look at it on a yearly basis, it's 0.15% of the American GDP. So it's not much about the how much, it's how long for. And this certainty for 10 years, I think, is crucial, and it's lacking in terms of private companies making the investment in Italy as well as elsewhere in Europe. I'll touch briefly at the end on the point that, again, Xavier, you raised about the cost of energy, which I agree, and you also said it. It's crucial, and it's interesting what you were saying earlier, Yannick, because one of the main debates in Italy. So you're saying that Germany has a problem in procuring this, whereas Italy, it's a hub with the Mediterranean, and it's currently during the last crisis, it actually exported gas to the rest of Europe, although the prices were pretty high. And one of the ambitions that Italy seems to have now is to become a gas hub, with the not openly but implicitly stated aim to be providing gas to Germany and the rest of Europe. And now I wonder, because if the cost of energy is one key factor, and Germany, and it's interesting what you were saying earlier, but I also have in mind that Germany has this really ambitious renewable penetration target. And I think this is not just in the short run. In the long run, if you're able to have energy that you can depend on, that you do not need to import by and large, and it's cheaper, you have a very significant competitive advantage, to the extent that even Italy has put forward some very ambitious renewable installation targets of 12 gigawatts per year. But if you also in parallel invest in gas infrastructure with a stated aim of servicing the north of Europe, which is already moving away from gas, then you are going to have stranded assets, and you will have lost some of that competitivity and lost some of those money that you would be better spending on other aspects of the transition, and as well as in your own electrification. Partly because for the bigger industries, how far you're able to decarbonize your energy grid, that this is how far you're going to be able to decarbonize that same industry, as well as a matter of competitivity. And I'll close here.
Thank you very much. That was very clear. When you talk about supporting consumption and referring to the IRA, I think that you also imply that there is a component which is going to favor batteries or cars made in Europe or in the country compared to made elsewhere. And maybe we can talk later of the recent proposal by the French government to or the way it is included in the bonus malus for buying a car. I don't know if it is very efficient, but I'm sure that some people there have some definitive answers to give us. Okay, but on next point, but time is fleeing. Sure. Too fast. And so I'm going to give the floor now to Daniel Fuentes, was you're a professor.
Yeah, that's right.
Professor of economics at yeah, and coming from Spain.
Yeah, that's it, from the University of Alcalá.
Yeah, and so well, Spain was mentioned as a possible place where to relocalize the German industry. That's interesting. Certainly.
Yeah, certainly. And actually, maybe, I mean, sorry. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me to be here. So I'm going to react to some intervention of my colleagues. If I well noted, Elvir talked about export controls, access to components, economic coercion, strategic autonomy. Janek talked about the competitiveness of the German industry, but in general, electricity tariffs, cheap green energy or cheap energy costs, relocation, and the video about reindustrializing, foster the supply chain, and blah 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 blah. That it is not only about green energy, it is not only about net zero industry, but it is also about competitiveness and the place of the EU in a new environmental or economic environment. And for me, this is the key point. The EU in particular, because China and the US, from my point of view, have made the choices, and the EU haven't done for the moment. So we face a trade-off between investment, the need for investment on the one hand, and the problem of the public debt on the other hand. And we need to make that choice. If we focus on investment subject to a constraint of public debt sustainability, or if we do the contrary, we focus on fiscal policies in sense of debt reduction subject to investment. And this is for me the key point. We need to decide if we go left or right, and in front of us, we have a China and the US that has done their choice. And we can wait not only for decarbonization or green or net zero industry targets, and that's all, but always because of all of these sets of reasons related to competitiveness and the place of Europe in the global industry. So I think one of the main topics in Spain all around this debate, it is on how to deal with between the need for investment, the need for how we can finance European public goods in a financial context where there are little fiscal space to deal. And this is the key point from my point of view. First, to decide whether we want to go for the investment side or debt side, and second, how to do it. And knowing that there is very little fiscal space in the Eurozone, knowing that this very little fiscal space is not, it's concentrated in so many countries, let's say Germany, Netherlands, and maybe some Nordic countries, but that's all. From the global perspective of the EU, the problem is there is no fiscal space. And the solutions over the table to finance this Green Deal are not, from my point of view, are not sufficient. If we go for this European Green Deal and an ambitious plan to replace the EU in a global commercial and strategic point of view in the global economy, we need more than the tools that we have, and we should defend a common capacity from the recent experience of the Next Generation funds, in sense of, okay, it is not only how much, but the key idea is how long. So if this kind of tools were structural and not just a one-off solution for 2022 COVID crisis, but a really structural tool linked to conditionality in terms of structural reforms and policy implications, and of course, indeed, fiscal rules. Of course, fiscal rules may have their space in the global set. But let's say, in my mind, the way of thinking should be, first of all, deciding if we go for the investment, knowing that we have important constraints of sustainability or not, first of all. Second, if we go, then we need resources. How are we going to finance this? And third step, with the current tools, it is not sufficient. We need new tools to do it. And one option could be to develop a common capacity from the experience of the Next Generation funds, in order to have EU safe assets and maybe a bigger European Union budget, because we are talking about European public goods. They are not only questions. You, Janet, were talking about relocation to other countries. That's the sign that this is a true, real European issue. It is not a national one. Of course, there are national implications. In that sense, could be loser from the point of view of Germany and winner from the point of view of Spanish in a hypothetical scenario. But in the end, it is an European problem how to deal with this new environment, and we need to act, and we need to go forward. From my point of view, it is now or ever. I mean, China, I repeat this idea, but China and the United States has done the choice, and the EU is still reflecting on how to do, for me, this is the key point, to make our choice, and then to give us ourselves the tools and the means, and to deal with this increase of investment in a very particular context of little fiscal space. Let's think, for me, the key point.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So there is a kind of consensus on the idea that it is the good perspective is the European one.
Yeah,
and that the stakes are really high there, and we can't play against each other in Europe.
That's it.
On those questions, of course. I forget you mentioned that
it's more a question of cooperation, not of competitiveness.
Yeah, and I forget to mention that you've been also working at the Prime Minister cabinet during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay. Laurie, it's your turn. You're coming from Finland. You're economist advising at the trade union SAC. Switch off your microphone. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's right. But one thing. Firstly, thank you very much for your kind invitation. Second point, I'm actually not an economist. I've studied energy policy, and my focus is on industrial and energy policy. But in any case, you can't look at these things without dabbling into economics every now and then. I'm gonna talk briefly about the Finnish perspective. I'll start first from the top and go down to to Finland's perspective about these issues. But one thing I want to about the sort of international context I want to make clear. There's this German term, is Wandeldurchhandel, which refers to this idea that economic dependency or economic interdependence creates a situation where which pacifies relations between countries. It doesn't work. Russian aggression showed that it doesn't work. I used to believe in the idea, but the war in Ukraine has showed that the theory has its limitations. And it has become clear that other countries' cultures and especially leaders have very different calculus in terms of national interest that we are used to. So it's just a very important lesson that we have to heed, in my opinion. It is, of course, far from certain whether same sort of escalation will happen in terms of our relations with China, but I think it would be foolish not to take that into consideration. For example, over Taiwan. And I guess this is why we are here now. The United States is doing its best to wean its economic dependence from China, especially on critical sectors. And the most notable example of these policies is, of course, the IRA. And we can conclude from the developments that globalization, in a way, is in retreat these days. I mean, even before the war in Ukraine and even before the IRA, it was clear that the sort of post-Cold War era of globalization and economic liberalization was coming, not perhaps to an end, but at least it was slowing down. But the question is, my first point, the question is whether this is complete slowdown or partial. I recently learned that Mexico and Canada actually can benefit from the IRA. They, due to their free trade agreements with the United States. And since Europe has aligned itself politically and militarily with the United States, maybe we should wake up trade discussions since the TTIP transatlantic trade and investment partnership, if I can remember correctly, was cancelled. Was cancelled or shelved during Donald Trump's presidency. Maybe we should look into the possibility of reviving trade talks with the United States so that we could cooperate on these issues. I mean, the other path would be, in terms of trade policies, would be to erect trade barriers. Both paths will take time, and they don't. Even if we would start, open talks about trade talks with the United States, it would take a very long time to materialize. It doesn't help us right now. But in terms of industrial policy, other speakers have already pointed out the EU's overdependence on critical raw materials and components in key industries. It has, of course, become clear in both EU capitals and Brussels that we cannot reliably reach our climate commitments without strong and determined industrial policy. It is, as a side note, it's a little bit funny to notice that industrial policy, it's not such a long time when it used to be almost a swear word, a heresy in a sort of a neoliberal world order, and it has become a sort of thing that's okay to say say out loud in any sort of policy circles. But industrial policy needs it needs sufficient financial backing, otherwise it's just talk. And I guess this is the sort of and this leads to the perspectives I want to bring from Finland. Everybody understands that we need to react and adapt to the changing situation. Trade is not free if the same rules don't apply to everybody. If you start subsidizing your own domestic industries, others have to react to that. We therefore understand the need for the EU to relax the state aid guidelines. However, like other smaller EU countries, we are worried about the prospects of a subsidy race. It is clear, in our view, we consider it sort of self-evident that if we end up in a sort of a subsidy race situation between EU countries, it will benefit countries, bigger EU countries that have sort of greater economic clout. And we are already seeing sort of aspects of this subsidy race. As the German speaker pointed out, there are plans to subsidize industrial consumers in Germany with a rather hefty price tag. Was it, well, dozens of billions of euros? I don't know if it's an annual basis or total until 2030, but it's just amazing sums. And I think we have a sneak peek already what a subsidy raise would look like. But what are the alternatives? Then the obvious question is, the European Commission has suggested that we could finance the green transition and support our strategic autonomy through new or existing EU funds. The proposed EU sovereignty fund would solve the problem of the subsidy race, but there are always caveats when the EU starts collecting and distributing money for new purposes, especially political caveats. And so far, the talk has been about using existing funds and possibly income from the CBAM or the carbon tariffs and the incomes from the emissions trading scheme. It would be definitely easier than joint borrowing. But the obvious question is whether it's enough, whether there's enough money to go around to sort of reply to our competitors' actions, as well as meet the demands of the green transition. From Finland's perspective, joint borrowing would be a very hard sell in political terms, even for such noble purposes such as the green transition. Basically, every single political party in Finland is afraid of touching the issue of joint borrowing because of fear for the populist party. They start making such a horrible fuss every time somebody even suggests or hints at increasing Finland's share of EU funding. And I know it's a little bit unfair, but they always come up with, really nasty examples. For example, a shady Hungarian businessman building a mansion, or a mafia-linked businessman building a mansion somewhere else with EU funding, and these sort of snippets start creating sort of resentment towards funding EU projects, or EU goals, and it's just the political reality that it is very difficult to sell such things, especially with the populists that are now sort of a mainstream of the political landscape in most European countries. On a side note, in Finland, we are actually in an interesting situation at the moment where the National Coalition Party, the Conservative Party, is actually in talks with the populists to form a government, right-wing government. And if we would see developments with for example, the EU sovereignty fund, I'd be very interested to see how they will be selling it to the national, the populists. But in any case, we'll see what happens. It's far from over, the government negotiations. But then again, there are also legitimate concerns about EU funding. For example, Finland is relying heavily, in addition to renewable energy, we're also relying heavily on nuclear energy in our transition and decarbonization. And we have, for example, have plans to build small nuclear plants that produce only heat, that would decarbonize the heating of biggest Finnish cities. Because we have this, I'm not sure if you're familiar with district heating systems, but basically it's, you have pipelines that deliver hot water around the city. If you have a zero carbon energy source, it's very easy to decarbonize the system. However, with EU rules, and well, I'm sure you're aware of this, there is a fairly widespread anti-nuclear sentiment in Brussels. I'm sure if we would come up with a joint European policies, for one reason or another, nuclear energy could be excluded, and a lot of people in Finland would consider that unfair because it's part of our strategy, and we have a solution for the waste, and so on and so forth. But it would probably favor approaches and policies that we would not perhaps choose ourselves for our country. The public discourse in Finland, it lags behind the European one in many ways. We come usually months or sometimes even years behind the other European countries. But I've so far said that, okay, there is skepticism towards both subsidies and joint European response to the situation, but you can't say no to everything. You have to, of course, at one point decide what sort of path you want to take. And with this, I'm referring to the sort of public discussion that is lagging behind the European one. I think we are not there yet in Finland. I have to be frank about that. But I'm sure everybody will realize that doing nothing is not an option either. And one final point. Currently, in my view, the level of ambition in terms of green transition and the sort of strategic autonomy in terms of key sectors. The level of ambition is nowhere near, nowhere far enough where it needs to be. Although it is actually a little bit hilarious that the political right at the moment, their main suggestions how to promote the green transition, the main elements are about cutting the red tape rather than, and that's the most ambitious sort of policy suggestions that we hear from the right at the moment. And like I said, if our ambition is not high enough, or if we're not close enough with our ambition, cutting red tape is certainly not even close. It's light years away from where we need to be, and this is because we are on the verge of two industrial revolutions. One, we need to decarbonize our societies, but and at a breathtaking speed. Second, we need to do it with resources and components that are at least mostly produced in Europe or in friendly countries. We will probably need many more other policies than just subsidies or support systems that we have been discussing about so far. For example, my last point, Finnish industrial history is, for example, full of examples of companies that the state has founded, state-owned companies that have been founded for specific strategic reasons and purposes. And vast majority of those companies have actually done really well historically. They are these days pretty ordinary companies, I suppose, but they've had a sort of a history where the state has, during a sort of a period of industrialization and modernization, the state has identified a sector where we're lacking a entity or company or anything that could do, for example, produce energy or refine oil, and the state has founded a company that does the thing. And my point is that there are a lot of private companies are really good at innovating, but they're also really good at avoiding risk. That's their other sort of main sort of area of expertise. But my suggestion is that maybe we should combine the ability to withstand risk that the state has with the sort of expertise that the private companies haven't found. For example, companies where you have the best of both worlds, not like categorically, but identify sectors or areas where progress is not fast enough, and might be even better sort of you might have better outcomes than just dishing out subsidies without thinking how that will actually lead to some beneficial outcomes. But I will end my presentation or my part with that. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laurie, for all those points. I'm going to leave the floor to Elinor Odeberg. Sorry for the pronunciation, which is probably wrong.
No, it's
okay.
You're actually
I'm very lucky today. So you chief economist at a think tank in Sweden, which is, let's qualify it as progressive.
Yep.
Yeah. You've understood that we have quite a progressive coloration there, and that we are proud of that. And so we are happy to share it. And so, yes, Swedish point of view, Stockholm.
Yeah, sure.
Time.
Right, you never know if it's best to be first or last, given the oxygen.
Well, you're
in the
last,
room.
so
yeah,
no,
I know.
no discussion there.
Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you, Thomas and the team for the invitation. It's very interesting to hear all these great insights and national perspectives. I feel, though, that there's maybe a need to sort of clarify what we mean by European industrial policy. And to me, it's seems to be sort of an interlinkage of climate, security, and growth. There's the necessity to transition, given that the industry emits 1/3 of our CO2 emissions. So that's not a question of choice. We need to transit the industry. There's also the question of the industry producing materials that are critical for the transition itself, solar panels, batteries, etc. Then there's the question of security in light of the war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, and seeing that there needs to, this discussion on strategic autonomy and what can be really left to the global market and what do we need to sort of have on European grounds. And Elvira, you gave a great oversight also on what goods are actually like in China at the moment. And I think that also leads to the questions, what is actually realistic when we talk about strategic autonomy? Like, I mean, in the perfect world, you would have everything, right? But that's not the case. So there needs to be a realism in that discussion as well. And I think that the answer to that question also sort of decides the path that Europe is going to go to. Is it a more protectionist one, or is it trying to sort of de-escalate these geopolitical tensions and these protectionist trends that we're seeing? And so far, they're more rhetorical trends than actual market trends. We're not seeing a decline in global trade as of yet. So that also needs to be kept in mind, I think. And then there's also the question, of course, of growth and jobs and prosperity for European citizens, and how can industrial policy encourage that? And I would like to just take a step back from a Swedish perspective. Sweden was one of the poorest countries in the world 100 years back. We were on a poverty level that's equivalent to Colombia today. And what lifted Sweden from that poverty was trade, industrialism, and welfare, expansion of the welfare state that was allowed, thanks to the growth that the industrialization gave to Sweden. Our industry now is 80% exports. So we are a small, open economy, very export-driven. Also, our whole wage bargaining system relies on the productivity of the industrial sector, meaning that there's a central sort of mark on what the general wage increases should be based on how productive the industrial sector is. And this is the theory is that since the industry is competing on a global market, they can't have salaries that are very different from other countries. And that's why it's also should be on the general wage rate. So what happens in the Swedish industry is sort of crucial for the whole of the Swedish economy and workers' salaries and prosperity. And when we had in 2007, the then right-wing Prime Minister Fredrik Reinfeldt, he was in Davos, and he was saying, well, you know, Swedish industry, it's basically gone. And he was referring to a general trend of service sectors growing and industrial sectors declining. And he couldn't have been more wrong, seeing now these latest developments, where Sweden has had very high ambitions when it comes to climate transition, and have been sort of a step ahead with these regulations, which has drawn industrial establishments to particularly the north of Sweden, where the energy is very cheap. And Sweden also being a country of industrial tradition, there's a competence there to sort of absorb these new establishments. And I would say that sort of the three key pillars for a successful industrial policy, whether it's on a national or European level, is not as much subsidies and tariffs, although that can play a part as we are in this current situation, but rather competence, the skilled workers, and also how to master artificial intelligence is a part and a key element of that. Energy, clean, cheap energy for the industrial plants. and infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I don't only mean roads or railroads, I mean housing, preschools, schools, hospital care. So now we're having this boom in the north of Sweden, where there's actually a growth of 10 to 50,000 jobs in these new green industrial sectors, producing steel without coal. There's sawdust from the forest industry being used to biofuels, etc. To actually be able to recruit people, there's a huge need of new housing and new places in preschools and hospitals. So that is now sort of the bottleneck for many of these industries, that you don't have the resources basically to house the workers that you need. So to me, that those sort of three key pillars, infrastructure, energy, and competence, would be more what I think industrial policy should really focus on. There's also, as Lauri said, I mean, Sweden unfortunately comes from a little bit of the same anti-European sentiment culture. And this is also because Sweden, in pretty much any European fiscal context, is a net contributor. And now with the inflation shock, and in particular on energy prices, there has been a growing anti-European sentiment, which is very unfortunate. And there's a huge sort of challenge for politicians to say to Swedes that, on the other hand, we have a surplus in energy, we have a fossil-free energy production, but we're seeing record high electricity bills because we're part of the European energy market. And, you know, we could have gone the Spanish solution and decoupled, and we would have probably halved our inflation rate. But, you know, it's a question, again, of also European solidarity and how, like one can maybe be able to shield their electricity prices, but what happens in the next, and how should we see these public goods? Should we see them as national public goods, or should we see them as European public goods? Yeah, we have also, for sort of the record, we have an electricity zoning system, which some European countries have, but not all, not Germany, for example. If you had, that would have also shielded Swedish electricity prices. This means that in the north of Sweden, where the energy is really cheap, that's one zone, and that's where we have most of the energy plants. And then there's zone 2, 3, and 4, and zone 4 is the south of Sweden, which is also connected to Germany. And that's how the importation of high energy prices came to unfold. That there's much less energy production there. And the whole thought of what this zoning system, which I think came from the European Commission to begin with, is to create incentives for the market to have more energy plants. So in theory, south of Sweden would want to have more energy plants. Problem is, south of Sweden, it's much more densely populated, and that is why there's been a resistance to many energy plants. Whereas north of Sweden is much, 95% forest, but of course many people live there as well. But here also in this discussion of European industrial policy, I think there needs to be where is it most strategic to have sort of energy establishment and industrial establishments. Maybe it's not one size fits all, but we have an interlinkage. We can all benefit from our like individual countries' advantages and benefits. Lastly, I would also say that I don't think that there's been a sort of an overdependence on global value. I mean, yes, global value chains has played a part, but I think it's rather an over reliance on the market as sort of solving everything by itself. We've had a trend in the political regime on a European level and in many national levels, which is also explained in this rise of populist parties, also in my own country, where the state is taking a step back and we're just saying, okay, well, the markets will sort this out. There's the supply and demand will find each other and we'll have low energy prices again. And it doesn't really work that way. And you have to also be humble to the fact that there's many households that can't compete on a sort of raw neoliberal market, or they will be left behind. And therefore you would need state policy to shield those households from the negative aspects of this marketization. And I think that that's sort of what we're seeing now, where everyone's sort of newly awakened, seeing how many things that we thought were working aren't actually working. And now the US also being, I mean, sort of the champion of free marketization is saying, no, we're not doing that anymore. So I think that is sort of turning the tables, really. And I think that's where we should have the discussion on what are the public goods, what is realistic to sort of have in the European context, what should be left to the market, what should be more on the public control, and how do we make sure that everyone gets prosperous from these in a European industrial policy development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lino. Just for the clarification, the price of electricity, you mentioned it was high for households, but I guess that for firms that are going to settle in the north of Sweden, where there is cheap energy price and probably low connection to the open grid, then the price of electricity is going to be quite low. Am I right?
Yes, and that's why they're establishing there. And I know Yannick also touched upon this. I mean, this in the end, I mean, for now, since Sweden has a surplus of energy and and relatively low electricity prices in the north, we're attracting all these new investments, which is great. But I mean, of course, if energy production is not keeping pace, this will create a conflict between cheap household energy and cheap company energy. So you need to have an energy production that is keeping up speed. But it's true that many of these, I mean, battery plants that have their own contract with windmill park, for example, and just they're completely shielded from even what's going on the global energy market. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I would also, by the way, you mentioned the bonus malus system.
Yeah.
We've had that, but now the current government took away the bonus, and this is this is sort of now the electricity car market is completely iced.
By the removal of the bonus part of the bonus malus. Okay.
So bonus malus is that you're taxed higher if you have a petrol car and taxed lower if you have an electricity car.
Okay, Thomas, we are right on time. And so it's time for the debate. So let's open the floor to everyone. Please introduce rapidly yourself. And maybe you, like Guillaume, you just put your, if you have one. If you don't have, you don't have the right to speak. Okay, so Guillaume, Xavier, Wojtek, Nicolas, hi. Okay, let's go. Xavier, you want to start? Okay, so Guillaume, start.
Yes, thank you for this very complete presentations. I have mainly one point is, so IRA is the new thing in this landscape. Is it possible that we as European, we stay with our basic policy of high carbon price in that context? I know I've heard before that we give also subsidies to the industry and so on. I don't know exactly the amount of this subsidies because it's always the same money that is used a lot of time by President von der Leyen. But we are the only one to have a very ambitious with high carbon price policy for the green transition. I'm quite skeptical of the possibility to implement really the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It will be very difficult with many of our counterparts. Is it possible in this context that we stay with this kind of policy?
Okay, thank you, Guillaume, for asking. And so just to recall, the current price of carbon is 100 euro per ton, which is a very good thing for inducing a transition, of course, and it's definitively playing on the energy market, but it is also much higher than what it is elsewhere, and the reduction of free quotas is also going to increase that in the future. Xavier, you're next.
Xavier Rago, I have no stuff. I am a president of OFCE. I'm so happy to be here and to welcome you here. Two or three points about the French view, and I will let others qualify what understand the dynamic of the French debate on this subject. Indeed, as Thomas said, the Pisani-Ferry-Selma Mahfouz report was out a couple of days ago. It's a kind of important report about the policy mix for climate change in France. So it's a kind of a big event because Pisani-Ferry was kind of a main advisor of Macron. It's kind of influential, things like that. This being said, this is not the view of the French government, and there are a lot of debate about it. My view on the subject, when I read the Pisani report and so things that will be, I think, consensual, is that it's a kind of a shift toward the IRA dimension, toward state intervention and state aid and state investment at the national level, kind of. In the report, it's about lots of financing, taking into account the carbon price, which is still there in the debate, but is not the main tool anymore. In the tools is a lot of subsidies and some regulations at the national level, with some debate about more flexibility for the French public debt. What does it mean? It means that my understanding is that now, to speak about the European strategy to achieve zero net emission, it's a national, since from this report and what I hear here, it's a sum of national strategies with some room at the European level to have some financial needs for states to do that. Some flexibility, possibly in the pact, we'll see the evolution of the rules to do that. What is missing is really a European policy or coordination. It's kind of striking the Pisani part, is what we call for European policies is not there. It's the addition of national policies. There's some good part of it. There's no reason for Europe to decide in the details of what Sweden should do or France should do. So subsidiarity should be there for sure. But we feel, at least me, I feel some European big initiative is missing. I don't know, interconnection of energy, lots of technical things that we are in the debate are not there. And there's some debate about some tools which are a little bit abstract. For instance, some countries ask for central fiscal capacity, and France was part of it. I think it's many people think that if this will not go through, and so my understanding is many countries have a limit. At least France have a limited ambition on this side. They claim for European debt to finance stuff, but it's not really analyzed deeply. So my takeaway from all of that, not to be long, Xavier, I will close here, others will qualify that, is that we move toward more state interventionist than market mechanism in France. So move away from the carbon tax as the only mechanism. This will require a lot of state intervention, maybe a lot of fiscal space, and there will be a demand for fiscal space, but not really new big European plan at European level. And the Franco-German nexus, which we are working, I do not see there now. So I think there's an issue, Franco-German and maybe Italy and Spain and a couple of others, all of us. But there's no joint initiative on the table. It's a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, and debt is definitively not a way to coordinate industrial policy. We can agree on that. Just before leaving the floor to Wojtek, I remind to the online friends we have there that they, of course, can ask questions. It's going to be a little more difficult, but it's possible.
Thank you, Xavier. So Wojtek Janowski from Weblet Institute. And this is building, my question is building directly on your comments. So because several of you stress this need for looking for ways to go from non-cooperative to cooperative strategies here within Europe, but what could actually trigger that from your national perspective? Because you can call upon the EU level to find a solution, but what would be the accepted solutions from your different perspectives? And I would add a comment upon that it's what I miss, maybe a provocative comment, but I know what I miss from the industrial strategy, climate strategy, is the climate part, in the sense that, the first step is to have a vision of what is the transition path, in the sense of IPCC scenarios, thinking, etc., etc., etc. There's various scenarios, as you all know. There's a huge work done in France on this, linking the global objectives to more visions of the future of society that you wished to have, that we could have, and there is pluralistic scenario building, as there are several choices. But this I'm sure this work is done in every country by now. So the industrial climate strategy should stand out from some sort of vision of the future. And especially the progressive one, since you mentioned the word, Xavier. And then of course you have various industrial or energy, policy options. The nuclear energy was mentioned, etc. And this is, of course, all this is true, but there are also common points which are stressed by the IPCC, etc. For instance, the need to reduce the consumption in the future. The need to put sufficiency or sobriété, as you call it in French, into the path. So this could, for instance, link to investment policies where we're actually aiming not only at replacing old cars by new cars, but aiming at transforming away lifestyles. For instance, linking Europe through huge investment projects in railway, etc., etc., as the Asian continent is doing right now. So we're sort of cooperating through regulations, and they are cooperating through infrastructure. But I don't know if that kind of discussion is possible from the standpoint of the public discourse in each country. So that would be my question.
Thank you, Wojtek, for this point. Nicolas? Nicolas? Nicolas. Okay.
Thank you very much, Nicolas Bermond from IBRI, Sustainable Development International Relations, based in Paris. So I really liked your presentation. I think we have a very diverse. It's not working.
No, it's.
Sorry.
It's good. Okay. So I really like your presentation. As I was saying, for me, there's two things behind this push for industrial policy that we've seen as a reaction of IRA. What I've found very interesting and striking is that normally small incumbent companies that tended to make this case, whereas new companies investing in batteries, etc., were more happy to get more funding from the other side of the US, of the Atlantic in the US, and as a way of growing their market and say, well, in the end, it's not a big issue because it could decrease our cost later when we invest in Europe. Some obviously, when on the investment decisions, they're saying, okay, we go to the US first and we come back later, or we produce in the US and export, etc., etc. But actually, especially in the French debate, I saw that it's mainly like incumbents are making a strong case about that. So I wanted to ask you if it's something that you perceive also in your countries, that it's the incumbents that are saying, oh, we need a tax credit as the US, etc., etc., because I think it's really important. It's really important. Why?
because the solution proposed by new actors are not exactly the same that incumbents. Incumbents tend to secure infrastructure, secure solution as CCS, as hydrogen production, things that are really centralized and will need anyway subsidies if they are to be developed. Whereas new actors tend to be active on more modular or different transformations of industrial value chains. To take the example of steel, new actors as H2 Green Steel that exist in Sweden, they are focused on the initial phase of the reduction of iron, and then they don't invest necessarily in all the value chain. So it's a new business model, basically. And I tend to think that it's a promising one compared to the current organization of the steel industry. So just a question, like, what's your take on this? Like, do you see a difference? Is it all the industry that is advocating for that? Or is there a risk of, let's say, incumbents capture behind all this question on subsidy, etc.? And I second all the things that have been said about the necessity of a European approach in this context, because it's also, when we are 27 member states divided, it's easier to get, like, let's say, targeted by the same company, but to get the most advantageous deal for decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. Okay. Elinor, I think you want to speak.
Okay.
Definitely, I can see that.
In Sweden, the companies aren't asking for subsidies. There is pretty much no such debate, and which is also because the companies aren't trying to trigger it. It's more these structural factors that I was talking about earlier: competence, infrastructure, and cheap energy that is pulling investments to particularly the north of Sweden. So we don't really have that discussion. And when I think of what we could do on, like, sort of joint borrowing or common fiscal action on the European level, subsidies to private companies would be very far down the line, actually. You mentioned public railroads. I mean, that kind of infrastructural cross-country investments, that would be very interesting on a European level, and rather than sort of just subsidizing private companies. And I think what we maybe also forgetting is the potential of public ownership. In Sweden, we don't have a tradition of subsidizing private companies, but we have a big tradition, as in many other European countries for that matter, of public ownership of mines and railroads, etc. Some of these have been privatized with unfortunate results, but that is also a way of sort of trying to control prices and trying to steer investments. And I would say that the European regulation on public procurement would be my #1 go-to to try to steer investments and to steer towards climate, a more offensive climate agenda, which you also touched upon.
Okay, but providing cheap energy through public investment in energy production,
yes,
is not going to qualify as a subsidy, but it's going also to play exactly the same role.
I mean, I guess if you would go, I mean, in that case, yeah, if you would go for, like, sort of the very primary goods as energy is, I mean, energy, I think, should be considered like water. I mean, it has the same status in society.
Okay, even for industry.
For, you mean to have subsidies for energy plants? Is that what you're asking for? Yeah, I mean, but I think you can do that already.
Okay.
Yeah, you should. Yep.
Jake, yeah.
All right. Maybe quickly to the last question. I think in Germany it was also mainly the incumbents that were driving the discussion now, but I think maybe less because they were incumbents and established, but because the industries that are affected by the IRA are mainly industries with commodified and tradable goods. And that's, of course, then a challenge, for German, for French, for other companies if they are participating in these export markets, whether it's now steel production or chemicals production, battery, PV. I mean, these are all tradable, and I think economies of scale make quite a difference. And so these established companies that have economies of scale that are established, they are also affected most of the IRA. I think I would very much agree with the comment of the first commentator that the like a CO2 price based strategy really sort of faces challenges now when compared with a subsidy approach. And it's easily understandable, right? You increase the costs of the fossil alternative and make the green alternative competitive to it. But if you have another country that reduces the cost of the green alternative, and you then have a difference between green alternatives, around the globe, that of course, creates friction and competitive issues. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU can also only partially, when it comes, address that, but exports, for example, are not included under the CBAM. So clearly then these two strategies sort of, Europe would be at a disadvantage if the CO2-based approach is then not complemented also by a subsidy approach. Yeah, I could go on, but maybe leave it to the other colleagues.
Okay, so maybe we can use revenue from the CO2 trade market to subsidize the production of energy, cheap energy in Europe. Could be a way. Please go.
Thank you. I'll also start with from the last question. Yeah, I agree, and I can see the problem in the situation that we have with an added cost of carbon on the production. But there's various ways that you can. Obviously, we do need a shift. This is a policy that Europe has chosen and has gone down this path. We can debate whether it was the best policy or not, but this is the policy we have. And whilst it's true that it's questionable whether CBAM will have an effect and to what extent and whether it's workable even, and we definitely do have a problem coming with the ETS2 coming online. I think a lot can be solved by reorganizing the fiscality around the subsidies, and which are direct and indirect to harmful forms of energy production. If you had a coherent system of subsidy and support of clean versus non-clean, then you would have a much more manageable situation. And I mean, you have even with the ETS, you now have a situation where you're trying to incentivize electricity. You are paying the carbon price on the electricity that's generated through gas or coal, for countries that still have coal, but you don't have an equivalent ETS if you are heating your house with gas. So you have this is countersensical, because you're trying to put forward some policies which are environmental policies as well as energy policies, and obviously there is no coherence. So making all this coherent would go a fair way, I think, into solving some of this problem, which remains and needs to be tackled, I think.
Daniel.
Yeah. I don't have the impression, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't have the impression that in Spain the main issue was around tax credits or liquidity or subsidies. So of course there's a part of the debate on that, but I think the center of the debate is more on the access to the need for capital, for investment and on the long term, and maybe a very particular issue, Spanish one, I don't know, maybe it's shared, or we can see the same in other countries, but there is a debate also on the administrative barriers and bureaucratic barriers to boost this kind of investment. And I would say that maybe even, let's say the need for capital and the administrative barriers are the two main topics on the issue. Of course, there's always asking for tax credits, but yes, a noise. It is not the center of the debate.
It's easy to get the
No, I mean it's a classic issue. No, if they can have access to a tax credits, why not? But it is not. It is not. I don't think so. It is not a question of liquidity subsidies or tax credit or short terms, or it is more that an issue on the long term and access to capital and how to deal with the medium and long run. And it's seen as a clearly opportunity for energy industry in Spain. Of course, it's the opposite side of Germany.
Laurie?
Yeah, just a quick point. If you look at the sort of background of the IRA, in the United States, it's virtually impossible to implement an emissions trading system on a federal level. So therefore, they have had to choose the sort of policy path of subsidies, just because you couldn't get an ETS through Congress. The problem is, from a sort of an economics perspective, is that we know that almost certainly the sort of market-based ETS-based system is cheaper. It's cheaper to reduce emissions through a market-based system than through a subsidy-based system. But then again, when the Ukraine war started and the whole sort of energy war started with Russia, and the prices went up because of scarcity rather than anything else. But the sort of narrative, I guess this is the same in every other countries in Europe as well. The narrative, at least in Finland, that, for example, right-wing populists promoted is that this is because of the green transition. And then we are in a sort of constant battle to win the hearts and minds. We're in a battle of legitimacy. But the problem from a sort of macroeconomic perspective is that the subsidy-based system is more popular, but it's more expensive from a sort of a top perspective, or macroeconomic perspective. So therefore, I think we probably need, I don't know, we will probably need some sort of system how we tweak either whether it's for fuel. We have like in most European countries, we have taxes for fossil fuels that are based on the carbon content of the fuel, or we have the ETS. But on a sort of crisis situations, we probably will need some sort of valve that will ease off the pressure in order to, that doesn't undermine the credibility of the policy measure or system. But still, I mean, in the long run, if you ruin the legitimacy of green policies, you will, in the long run, you will go back to, the starting point, or, you won't get where you want to be at.
Very shortly, I keep thinking that the question, what can trigger cooperative behavior, is the most interesting one, and the one that is occupying us on a daily basis through all the European integration. So it remains a very open question. Of course, the joint purchases, it's a good contribution to that cooperative behavior. But I think that's providing or ensuring that there's transparency between all the different initiatives that are taken between the member states will be key, because for companies to have to understand what are the conditions offered in the different member states can be a nightmare. And at the moment where we put at the agenda of the TTC transparency on subsidies between the US and the EU, we should also be very careful about the subsidies that will be ensuring between the member states, and that's all.
Thank you. I think that Vincent OCU wants to say something.
Yes, I'm Vincent Ossius from France Stratégie.
I'm not speaking on behalf of the government. We are an autonomous public think tank. Just one of key issues that you mentioned, there is really an issue in relation with the price of carbon in Europe in comparison to the other continents. And clearly, we have an issue of inflation and competitiveness. And with ETS and CBAM, we basically risk having more delocalizations and losing industrial bases. And clearly, we know that currently the incentives for the companies to invest in decarbonization are not sufficient, and because of course they have in mind that their competitors in third countries, when the price of carbon energies will fall, if in Europe the producers have invested in decarbonization, then basically they will not be competitive, and they will lose their basically some of their exports, but also on the European market, because we know that the CBAM will not correct all the effects in terms of competitiveness, in particular for basically the products which are not covered by the ETS. We cannot apply the CBAM on these products, and basically also the increase of prices will have impact, of course, on the costs of other sectors not covered by ETS, but of course for them the cost will increase. And so that will have a return effect on the industry, because of course if prices are going up in services sector, we know the impact it will have on industry. And the same the impact on wages, and so we have the risk of a vicious circle with higher inflation, higher prices, higher so basically wages rising, and then of course fueling the rise of production costs for companies. And of course, if we lose competitiveness, and so with the negative impact on GDP, on employment, and of course, negative impact on public finance, we will lose our capacity to basically invest even more to decarbonize and publicly finance the public good. We know it's a big issue. In the Pisani reports, we have basically put some numbers in terms of impact on competitiveness and on GDP, but they are underestimated by the macroeconomic models, because they don't take into account the whole basically the whole vectors that we will have in terms of inflation and the loss of competitiveness, because they don't take into account the indirect effects. For example, on services sectors, they don't take into account the link between wages and prices, and sorry, on prices and wages and in return. So there's a big issue, and of course, the solution of subsidies, it's not really a performing solution, because we need to finance the subsidies. So we need to raise the tax rate, and of course that will also dump our competitiveness. And this is an issue, and something. And my question will be, if you see an interest in this, another way of doing basically incentivizing decarbonization without mining our competitiveness, an option will be to put a tax on the final product consumption.
especially starting on mass markets products, taking into account the carbon content on the whole production chain, with, of course, first rising income of households by declining some taxes. And so that could be done basically in reducing inequalities. So basically doing that will not that will not incentivize raise of wages by companies. That will be just the tax reduction, which will raise the income of households. And basically, given that the products in Europe are less carbonized, that would be more basically something positive in terms of competitiveness of products produced in Europe, and that would also foster our attractiveness. And so basically that will have a positive impact on GDP, on employment, on industrialization. And of course, that would generate more public finance that would be positive to improve our investments in terms of decarbonization, because we know part of the investment need to be done by the public sector. But that incentive will also foster private investment in terms of decarbonization. So the share of investment for decarbonization will be the largest part will be financed by the companies, by businesses. Basically, of course, one of the challenges how to basically measure the carbon content on all the products. For that, we know that there are already startups developing technologies on this. And basically, we could start with the first step, which would be carbon content labeling, which would be compulsory on all products. That would be already something that would orientate part of the demand towards less carbonized products, for example, for vehicles and things like that. And we know that that would have an impact on the basically the brand image, and so that would already represent some good incentives for companies to decarbonize. And they would have the possibility basically to argue that they are less carbonized than what the database would give. And to do that, they would have to develop their carbon accountancy with a certificate institution labeled by the at the European level. And so that would develop carbon accountancy. And at some point we could decide that carbon accountancy will become compulsory, at least for the big companies. And that would produce the detailed information of the carbon content on the whole production chain for most of the products. And so that would be the right way to basically, after a few years, setting up that tax on the mass market final products. And just after, it could that tax could be enlarged to cover biodiversity and other environmental aspects.
You have thought a lot about it. Do you have a text, something?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Vincent. Is it time to conclude, Thomas? Well, we are organizing this event with our German friends, so that give us some strict constraints on the organization. We are not used to that kind of thing, but we engage ourselves to follow the strict time schedule of the event.
No.
So I'm asking Thomas, basically.
No, I think that depends on the interest to continue. If we have time, if there's more interest for more discussion, but I don't know with regard to the transmission for participants, online participants, how much time do we have?
We can go on, it's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So, well, maybe we are not going to continue for all night. Nevertheless, but I think that the German rigor is kind of soluble in French attitude. So that's good information too. Maybe one last call of question from the online participants. If they want to speak, this is the moment. If it is not, so let's wait a few seconds. If there is no any more questions or interventions, maybe we can do a quick tour of the panel, and maybe you can try to sum up in a few words. Let's say one sentence, but sum up not what you were thinking or are thinking about the question, but what you think others have brought to your mind in terms of proposals or elements important for diagnosis that you had not initially in mind. So not what you came with, but what you are going to go home with. Janek, I think you're inspired. One sentence.
That would be a long sentence. I'll just end by saying that I think what was a really good impetus for me was a comment by the colleague that actually just left the room, who said that, you know, and I think it links very much to the discussion that we had in the Pisani-Ferry report, but also in the current European politics. We don't really see a push for proper European collaboration. And I mean, I can propose one very quick answer, and that is, you know, if you talk to German policymakers, to German industry, they fear that the more collaborative the European strategy is, the more, you know, national interests will lose, at least in the short term. You know, you would have competitive tenders on a European level all of a sudden, and steel production plants or car manufacturing is actually maybe less competitive than in some other areas. And so maybe it's actually the right approach to say, okay, we want more European collaboration, but then we need to design it in a way that even if funding is coming from the EU, you know, member states, still similar to how we have done it in Next Generation EU, have sort of independence over how to distribute the money, and there's certain quotas for what member states will get out of European funding. And yeah, that was more than a sentence. So
David?
Yeah, I'll take over. There's a few for me, but if I have to choose one thing, I think you've just illustrated it quite well now. So it's really interesting for me, coming from an Italian perspective, to have an insight in what are the worries of a country which in Italy, for certain, as well as imagine in other countries, is a model of integration and of pluralistic thinking in terms of EU. So it's really interesting to see that it's not always like that, and there are some fears, worries that are not only similar to those in Italy, but also have an impact in the German thinking as a leading country in Europe. So that was very insightful for me.
Thank you, David. Daniel?
I would like to say that it's more a question of on long run than on short run, and there is a clear need for European Union public goods. So that means more cooperation, way of thinking in the approach.
Okay. Elvira?
Well, what I'll keep in mind is that we need to broaden the discussion to broadly competitiveness in the single market, and that the companies are not only focusing at should we invest now in green technologies because there's opportunities, that subsidies, until what are the broader conditions for greater competitiveness in the single market. And what you mentioned about competences, infrastructure, but even schooling and capacities, all those factors. And we know that banking union is another issue, but it's about addressing together those issues about EU competitiveness more broadly.
Okay.
One thing that stuck to my mind was that the situation in Sweden. We're actually heading towards a little bit similar situation, that the bottleneck won't be investments, but skills and skilled workforce. And it would be very awkward to find yourself in a situation where that's actually the thing that's holding back the development. It's a very good point. I need to take that with me.
Elinor,
All right.
you started last, you're ending.
Well, I would like that maybe the next discussion, seeing as it's a lot of like how do we access capital, how do we ensure these investments, and what are the structural possibilities for that. Maybe the next session should be on the ECB and the interest rates, which is really hurting now climate investments and new investments in the green industry. So I think maybe the fiscal rules regime and monetary policy are next issues in line for this discussion. Thank you very much for all these insights.
Thank you. And if I may add just one final word on what I'm going to take from that. I think what you said about, what you said about the fact that being progressive would be to provide cheap electricity, clean, cheap electricity to everyone, just like if it was water, could be also something very important in order to solve all what you have mentioned in terms of acceptance, the risk of the populist drift there, and the fact that it's not only a question of competitiveness, it's also a question of people being able to live the way they want to live. Nicolas, you want to say something?
I think it's a good conclusion, but no, I just wanted to say, maybe because we didn't come to this point during the debate, but the point that Elvire made on the relationship with other countries, I think it's pretty important, but we shouldn't only limit that to access to mineral, the critical mineral. Like there's also an argument to say that opening markets for these new technologies that European actors are investing in should be part of it. Like it shouldn't be, let's say, wine and old cars against minerals. It should be broader than that. But that's
But by the way, if any of you has any suggestion for future debate that we may hold in this format, do not hesitate to send us an email and to make some proposals. We are very open. And so we would welcome those suggestions. Really. Thomas, you want to close the board?
To close, just to add what you said, we have started to organize two of this kind of these debates each year, and we have now the first one for this year. So we are still thinking about the second event, the second discussion for the second semester. And if you have suggestions, we are very open to think about it. But I think I'm also impressed by that common perception that is lacking, that we have a lack of common European ambition with regard to the industrial policy. Perhaps we could dedicate the next debate on how to promote more cooperative behavior. We are 1 year ahead of the next European elections. I think it's a moment to think about what we can do as a common strategy in Europe. And perhaps that might be a subject for the next debate. But again, your suggestions are welcome. And thanks again, Javier, for the hospitality. I think we are very glad to be here in the OFCE.
Yeah, well, it has been shared. And so we are very happy to. And I thank you very much for all your participation, your inputs, for keeping the time and making this event a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.